Hi, Joe. How are you today?
Hey, Elliot. I'm doing great. As always, really excited anytime I get a chance to participate in the ongoing TWIA series. But how are you doing?
I'm good. Actually, as our listeners know from last week, John's in transit to Milwaukee. One of his daughters is getting married here on Saturday of this week, and my daughter is getting married this Thursday. So it's all weddings all the time for the TWIA team. But I didn't have any travel since it's about 15 minutes to the venue to when I need to go to my daughter's wedding. You and I are going to do today's episode. So, where would you like to start?
I thought, we've probably got 6 or 7 pieces here. I thought it might be best to start actually in Southeast Asia. So I'm not sure if you saw, but there was a new United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime report that came out. The full report, in all honesty, I believe is somewhere between 240 and 260 pages. So would not necessarily recommend, although some of you may find that to be light reading. But I was most drawn to this press release that essentially outlines how the report has revealed the scale of Southeast Asia's ever more interconnected criminal economy. And so it goes into great depth as it relates to all of these different what I would consider tentacles of the larger money laundering, fraud, and just organized crime, I guess, vehicles, if you will, that are all kind of established and are running at more or less like an enterprise scale that we're seeing coming out of Southeast Asia. Specifically, this release came out of Thailand. But was curious your thoughts on that in terms of anything that you pulled out of the report or certainly the press release that we were reading.
Yeah, I did not read the entire report. I'll fess to that, but I did read a fair amount of it. The report's actual title is "An Interconnected Criminal Ecosystems Transnational Organized Crime Threat Assessment for Southeast Asia." UNODC did an earlier version of this about 6 years ago in April of 2019. And as the title tells, and as you indicated, it focuses on Southeast Asia. It talks about Southeast Asia being a hub for transnational criminal activity that is global. It also it goes through a variety of the types of crime and related criminal activity and infrastructure activity. There's a long list of them, and I'm not going to read it, but big picture drugs, technology innovation, gambling on illegal online platforms, and many others, trafficking in persons. I think the big conclusion that comes out of this is what you mentioned, and that is 6 years ago when they did the report, the focus was still primarily on the sale of goods, so illegal goods, illegal drugs, things like that. Now, there, the report concludes in part that we've shifted, and we're primarily seeing services. So many of these transnational criminal organizations are offering fraud as a service. We worry about banking as a service. They're scaling fraud as a service, and as you said, to enterprise and even industrial levels. So, and they're innovating as fast as those of us on the defense side are, and and in many respects, we're actually playing catch up. So, I think it's a worthy skim. Certainly, the introduction, the high points, that kind of thing, I think would be worthy because there's a lot in there, as John would say, there's things in there that could be spun into good training materials and things like that. But as you point out, a 250-ish page report is not something you're going to hand to each one of your analysts and say, okay, here's today's homework. Some synthesis and focus is necessary. But the UNODC, as with some of the other major organizations that we often talk about, FATF, Wolfsburg Group, both of which we're going to talk about later today, they put out high quality material, deep research, and they're valuable tools, things that all of us in the space should be monitoring on a regular basis.
No doubt. And to your point about, well, I guess both mentioning FATF, but also staying in the realm of organized crime, I also saw this week there was a news report that came out of AML intelligence. The report was titled "Organized Crime Moves Billions Through Crypto. Some Stablecoins Impossible to Seize or Freeze per FATF." And so, again, not to beat what would be essentially a dead horse here, I think the running thread here is certainly the focus around organized transnational crime, or I'm blanking on the actual acronym for it, but my point being, I think I think what we're seeing is less of, these spontaneous one-offs and more of what I would consider like a pattern. And this pattern is showing to, what we saw in the other report as well, this ongoing kind of transformation of these crime syndicates and looking for more ways to establish, I don't know if I would call it legitimacy, but certainly more of a structural procedure or infrastructure that allows them to essentially carry on their business at a much higher clip than I would argue what we've seen in probably the past decade. But, in terms of the specific around what FATF had warned, I know that there were a few call outs there specifically around, how they're utilizing, cryptocurrencies, and in this case, the use of stable coins in the past year to really kind of move illicit funds around the world. But thoughts on that from your perspective?
So we're talking about the seventh targeted update on implementation of the FATF standards on virtual assets and VASPs. By the title, we know that this is something that FATF has been working on continuously for a while. And you're right, it does focus on the fact that organized crime is taking advantage of the regulatory gaps that allow illicit proceeds to be moved through the crypto industry. And stablecoins are becoming more attractive because other cryptocurrencies, virtual assets, have a value volatility issue. And by their name, the concept behind stablecoins is that they have a more stable value. So the shift to stablecoins in part is taking out currency volatility risk, which you wouldn't think of, but that they talked about crypto-enabled crime becoming more complex and interconnected just in the last year. They talked about the fact that regulators, banks, and crypto companies face significant, and I'm quoting here, significant and ongoing challenges in detecting and stopping dirty money flows from scam compounds. So now we're back to Southeast Asia, and investment fraud networks, which we haven't specifically talked about today, but we certainly have talked about in other episodes. And then significant gaps remain in translating risk assessments into actual steps to reduce crypto crime. And we know from previous conversations, the program rule in the US now will specifically require risk assessments, which is a good thing. Some clarity and risk assessments well done are valuable. But I think the whole idea of being able to translate your risk assessments into actionable programmatic activity continues to be an ongoing challenge, not because people don't know it's important, but it's it's like the drawing of a new airplane with new technology, and there's process between that drawing, turning it into plans, and then actually putting one in the air. And that's really what we face. We face a similar challenge between the risk assessment process and active interdiction and detection. So
Correct. I mean, the word that comes to mind is almost a lag, right? And I think that's what we've
yeah,
seen. FATF's efforts, this being the seventh, to your point, I'm certain that this will not be the last one that they put out on this particular topic or area. But there's clear that there's still a lag. There's some numbers in this report too that kind of talk about the comparison in terms of some of the legislation that's been implemented specific around the travel rule. From 2025, there was about 73% of surveyed jurisdictions. So not necessarily including all of the global jurisdictions, but at least the ones that were surveyed. We saw a 10% increase to an 83% that have now implemented some form of legislation, especially around the travel rule. So again, more or less still leaves you the better part of 20 of surveyed jurisdictions, let alone the ones that went unsurveyed that are still trying to play catch up. And so, to your point, it's something that we'll continue to monitor, obviously. But moving on, I feel like I'm driving this whole thing. I'd be curious in terms of other things that you saw this week.
Well, I mentioned, so we've talked about FATF. The Wolfsburg Group came out with new guidance on uh, on how financial institutions should conduct a thorough assessment of the specific non-bank payment service providers, so PSP is the acronym, activities and flow of funds, so they understand the unique risks. So most bankers, most folks in the traditional financial services space are familiar with the wire systems, other systems in the US. There's the automated clearinghouse system, ACH. There are parallels to that in other countries. But now, with the technological innovation, we have a wide variety of non financial service providers in the payment who are payment service providers, new rails and things like that, and understanding how they work and the funds flow, because many of them ultimately the funds do end up in the traditional system. And so the Wolfsburg Group provides some strong recommendations. Also, it talks about ways to do this, to make these assessments, so you really know who you're dealing with. And again, as John and I have talked about in other episodes, Wolfsburg Group does a nice job of providing practical insights, and you can find the report on their website.
Absolutely. I would say too, and while obviously not from Wolfsburg, I thought I saw some similar language that came out of AMLA this week, specifically around what they've termed as the non-financial sector. And in this case, it was specific to blind spots that they were uncovering for every country, as the director of AMLA kind of pointed out. Quote, the non-financial sector is really a blind spot for every member state. This was within the prism of, really looking through how businesses and supervisors outside of the financial sector still seem to require more time to adapt to some of the new anti-money laundering rules, which, in itself is a challenge, but also a good reminder that, regardless of how familiar you are as either a traditional actor like a bank or a financial institution, or something more along the lines of a gatekeeper, the emphasis still remains, right? And at this point, it's really critical for some of these other, again, non-financial sectors to begin really investing the time and getting smart around, unfortunately, the challenges and threats associated directly or indirectly to their organizations as it relates to illicit actors that are, again, trying to circumvent some of the traditional financial compliance regulations within the larger global economy.
Yes, and both her remarks and an announcement coming out of FIU Deutschland zeroed in part on the real estate markets. The fact that they have the possibility of being a place to either hide or launder illicit funds, and particularly the comments coming out of FIU Deutschland was that it's more than just the purchase transaction. So there's a lot of people in the chain of real estate transactions, and bad things or corrupted things can happen pretty much at any step in the chain. But then there are, on a going forward basis, there's servicing activity that happens if there are loans. There's also all kinds of service providers to large real estate holding companies and things like that. And so understanding kind of the full dimensions of real estate activity, both residential and commercial, and those things have become more global, like everything else. So again, we've talked about real estate here in the US. We've gone back and forth about, it took a long time to get real estate included. Now we're not so sure how we want to include it. So, and this is something that, other countries have been probably earlier to the party, but still not at the level that they have been with other industries. EU and UK have done more in the real estate space, but still not 100%. And once you get to real estate, you're touching a lot of the gatekeepers, attorneys, accountants, things like that. So again, nothing. Wouldn't say there's anything new here other than people continue to raise the consciousness of the fact that we haven't taken a full-on approach globally, and that can we can feel comfortable like everything's fine until if you really think about it, what are we doing in these spaces? So
That's right. And specifically on, they listed, at least in terms of the analysis of what FIU Deutschland found, there's a list, and I'm not going to read it, but there's a list of probably 9 or 10 methods of operation that kind of came up pattern-wise in the STRs that, they were analyzing. It seems like this week is, if there was a running theme through all of this, Elliot, this week seems to be a lot of reminders. I'm not sure if you saw, but there was also, another article that the title is KYC Failures Top EU Banks Money Laundering Weaknesses, AMLA says. So again, AMLA's been very busy this week, as admittedly as they should be.
well, they were having meetings in Brussels with members of the European Parliament. So
Right.
there were, when folks like that get together, it's not surprising that there's a lot of comments, and there are speeches and presentations and announcements. And as we've talked about, since the passage of the new regime that created AMLA, the entity, they've got a gigantic list of things to do and a time clock that's ticking.
Well, and admittedly, it's a good thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, I
AMLA
agree.
should be noisy at this point. I think the resounding message that I got from this too is to, in part to your point, I wouldn't consider any of this novel. There's nothing new here, as much as it is just a good reminder and just a reprioritization of things. I'm going to read directly from this excerpt here, but AMLA specifically called out material weaknesses identified across a broad range of institutions. They weren't just limited to, the large or high risk entities. Those differences influenced by sectoral and national supervisory approaches included things like failure in identifying and verifying customers, beneficial owners, inadequate screening of PEPs, as well as just kind of insufficient risk profiling leading to the misclassification of high risk customers. So again, nothing new here as much as it is just a good reminder, if that's the proper definition here, of things will continue to progress, and we're excited to see some of the things that AMLA has sunk its teeth into, but ultimately the burden will still lie with these institutions in figuring out better ways to not only service their customers, but obviously make sure that those customers are protected from illicit actors.
I think the good reminder for our listeners in the U.S. is that even though AMLA is regulating in the EU, most of the things they're talking about, like this, are good reminders, as you said, for anybody who's running a program. Just has it become so routine we're really not paying attention to it? And while I know that where we can, we're automating all kinds of functions, even the automation has to be double checked every so often. Are we really asking the right questions? If we're using scoring models, are they accurate in terms of whether a flag goes up that says higher risk, additional activity required, things like that. So I think paying attention at least to the top level things coming out of AMLA is good for people around the globe, because so much of what we're trying to do, regardless of where you are, is similar enough that when an organization like AMLA is raising a flag, it's probably a flag for everybody.
I would agree. Right. And I'm sure everybody could make an argument for nuance here and there, but I could not agree more with you in terms of just a more general approach. It's probably good to keep an eye on what your neighbors are doing. You might pick up a couple things. And if not, again, really good reminder, and to continue down the path that you're currently, trotting on.
Right.
Okay, well, I think the only other piece, and this will be the first thing that brings us back, at least domestically, at least where you and I are sitting here in the States. But it's a good, again, another good reminder as it relates to the emphasis around internal training, as well as, making sure that your program accounts for things like, insider threats. And in this case, we did see a former TD Bank employee sentenced for pleading guilty to facilitating money laundering scheme that moved hundreds of millions of dollars through the bank's accounts. So I'm sure you saw this one. There were two employees that were mentioned in this article. I think the big one in this case, or probably the more prevalent one, related to the insider threat, where there was an exchange of value through the use of approximately $11,000 in gift cards as payment or value add in exchange to move about $92 million illicitly through the bank. So, any thoughts on that? I would just say, from my perspective, it's a good battle cry in terms of ensuring that your program is up to date as it relates to some of the internal training, the policies and processes you put in place. But then also making sure that there are enough mechanisms in place to, also allow for the safety for things like whistleblowing, and making sure that, as it was stated in the prosecutorial, piece of this hearing, that there were other employees that essentially had raised their hands and said, "Hey, there's something funny going on here."
Insider threats are, in many respects, the toughest. We do a lot in all of our organizations to harden our systems, to harden our procedures against outside threats. We do our best to do it against inside threats, but inside threats are tougher, and this is to manage. And this is a great example that, this was done using official bank checks to launder the money. And it was, a person who apparently was able to override limitations or was high enough placed that their authority was sufficient to make these things happen. But so and we've talked about this many times on some of our AML conversations podcasts with experts about how to manage and detect internal stuff. And I know when I was a practitioner, figuring out how to do internal detection was always something that we thought about. And it's a complex combination of culture, systems, training, and you need to be vigilant about it.
Absolutely. So, with that, I think that runs us clear across the horn. I would say a huge mazel to both you and John. By the time that this airs, at least one of you will have a daughter married, and the other one will be working on it.
Well, he has one daughter already married,
True,
so
true. Good cleanup. But I would say too, by the time this airs, we will have also concluded our monthly webinar on AI and in financial compliance. So just encourage folks. I happen to be moderating, so I'm probably a little bit biased here, but shameless plug, would encourage folks to keep an eye on that for when it hits the website, probably next week, as well as a shameless plug on our August webinar coming up, which is going to be the risks related to virtual assets. So again, I know you've been working on an impressive panel for that conversation.
Yeah, that'll live stream August 27th, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And by the time you hear this episode, you should be able to register on our website. So, and then John did a really interesting, I think he mentioned last week that he was getting ready to do it. He did an interesting interview with Tess Davis from the Antiquities Coalition. And by the time you hear this, or midtime next week, you should be able to hear that conversation, which I strongly recommend. So, Joe, thanks for sitting in. It's been great to talk with you. And I'm sure we'll do this again at some point in the future.
I always look forward to that. So I'm glad you left the door open there, Elliot. But always a pleasure, and I look forward to the next time. But until then, we'll see you soon.
You be well, and bye-bye to all our listeners.